he said, be steadfast in the Lord. Do you know what C.S. Lewis said? Almost no one has ever argued out of Christianity. When someone falls away, he says, you know what happens? This is Lewis speaking. He says, you know what happens? They usually fall into sin. And then they say this, nah, I'm not following Christ anymore. I've been thinking. Did you catch that? They don't want to say, I've been a lousy guy. They say, I've been thinking. Christianity is not all it's cracked up to be. They translate bad actions and say Christianity doesn't add up in terms of thinking. First thing Paul says, if Christ has been raised from the dead, be steadfast. You know, more people fall away from peer pressure than from anything else. You parents, you want to hear a scary statistic? About 80% of our young people, whatever this means in the statistic, about 80% of our young people, quote, lose their faith when they go away to college. 80% lose their faith. Paul said, if Christ has been raised from the dead, be firm, be steadfast, let nothing move you. You know why? Because if Jesus is the Son of God, He died for your sins, He's been raised from the dead, you don't need to know any more than that. You can be sure of your faith. Be steadfast. Secondly, verse 1558b, he says, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Folks, I wish I could talk to you about this point alone for the whole night. We don't talk about good works in Christianity because we think good works militate against salvation. You say, well, what about Ephesians 2:8-9? Well, let's think about Ephesians 2:8-9. Not of works, lest any man should boast. You're saved by grace through faith, and that's not of yourselves. See? That's why we don't talk about good works. But what's Ephesians 2:10 say? We are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works. Here's biblical theology. You're not saved by good works, but you are saved to do good works. The next thing Paul says is, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And to show you Paul's a good Baptist, the very next verse, 16:1, he says, after telling you your neighbor in the Lord is not in vain, he says, hey, I know some poor Christians. Get your wallets out. We're taking an offering up tonight. Just read 16, first few verses. He says, I'm taking an offering for poor saints. See his argument? Christ has been raised. You'll be raised too. Stick in there. Don't lose your faith. Secondly, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Get your wallets out. We got some needy people. Paul saw an argument. Seriously, he saw an argument from the resurrection of Jesus all the way down to helping people. Let me tell you something. This is a sentence that'll blow your mind if you think about it. The Bible tells us that we're going to have different positions in heaven, I believe. We're going to have differences in heaven. We call them rewards. There will be differences in heaven depending on what you've done with Christ after salvation. Let me say it again so nobody calls me a heretic. You are not saved by works, but you're saved unto good works, so that everything you do with Christ after salvation determines the capacity to which you will enjoy eternity. Let me say it again. Everything you do with Christ after salvation determines how much you will enjoy heaven. How many times do you have to say that before you realize that this life is worth living? How many times do you have to say that before you realize that if heaven's down there sometime after 2004, I better be a little more diligent right here? How many times will I wish in eternity that I'd done a little more for the Lord? You say, isn't that selfish? Well, we can talk about that another time. But all I can tell you is the Bible tells you, Jesus himself says, lay up for yourselves rewards in heaven. Matthew 6. All right, let me back up to the last point. It's the very first one on your PowerPoint. Paul says so far the resurrection makes two huge differences. Be steadfast, don't fall away. You got the greatest message in the world, don't walk away from it. Secondly, he says your labor in the Lord's not in vain. But before he said those two, if you go back to 53 through 57, he says, you know something? He says, you're going to be raised like Jesus if you are in him. Let me flash back with you to 1995 when I watched my wife die of stomach cancer. I had discussions with the Lord on the front porch. I thought to myself, great, my doubts are going to come back again. They didn't, and I thank the Lord for that. But here, folks, pain and suffering, sometimes the Bible tells us why we suffer. Sometimes the Bible doesn't tell us where we suffer. Let me give you the key in either case, whether you know or whether you don't know. Let me give you the case. The theme of the book of Job, I think, is this. Job realized that he knew enough about God to trust him in those things he didn't know. Job realized that he knew enough about God to trust him in those things he didn't know. Now, do we know more or less than Job did today about the Lord? More or less. What do you think? More. We've got the whole New Testament. And Job probably lived back during the time of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. We know so much more about the Lord today. So let me plug the resurrection in. If this is a world where Jesus has been raised from the dead, this is a world where there's meaning in suffering or non-suffering, whether you know why you're suffering or not. It makes no difference if you know why you're suffering or not. If this is a world where Jesus has been raised from the dead, there's a purpose for suffering, even if you have to wait till heaven to find it out. But don't walk away from the Lord because of suffering, because you've got the resurrection. The resurrection says it'll all work out. That's what the resurrection says. If you know Jesus has been raised and will be raised the same way, it'll work out.